Hey everyone, this is a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. The section's titled Terrorism and the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. And it's from the chapter on the political revolution. In the summer of 1918, Karl Kautsky published a pamphlet under the title, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat. Wikipedia says, the dictatorship of the proletariat, published in German as Die Diktatur des Proletariats, is the name of a 1918 pamphlet by prominent Marxist Karl Kautsky. The dictatorship of the proletariat criticizes the Bolsheviks, arguing the Bolsheviks eschewed democracy in favor of military force when establishing the Russian SFSR. In The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, Kautsky argues that, quote, the antagonism of the two socialist movements, bracket, i.e. Bolshevism and non-Bolshevism, end bracket, is not based on small personal jealousies. It is the clashing of two fundamentally distinct methods, that of democracy and that of dictatorship, end quote. Kautsky concludes that the Bolshevik understanding of, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, does, quote, not promise good results for the proletariat, either from the standpoint of theory or from that of the special Russian conditions, end quote. Kautsky. And it says, in response to the dictatorship of the proletariat, Vladimir Lenin wrote The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky in 1918, in which Lenin argued that the Russian Revolution had proceeded in the only way possible, and that the Russian Revolution had engendered rather than curtailed democracy. Kautsky subsequently responded to Lenin's counterattack with a second pamphlet, Terrorism and Communism, published in 1919, in which Kautsky argued that, quote, the Bolsheviks, survived not as socialists, but as architects of a bourgeois regime, end quote. Leon Trotsky then replied to Kautsky with a work also titled Terrorism and Communism in 1920. The historian Fernando Claudin later characterized the dictatorship of the proletariat and Kautsky's Terrorism and Communism as, quote, the two basic texts of the Kautskyan assault on Bolshevism, end quote. And back to the text. In The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, Karl Kautsky argued that the Soviet dictatorship was not that of a class but of a party, that power had come to be wielded by a handful of men, and that in the end this would undermine, perhaps make impossible, the goals of socialism. Footnote: Rosa Luxemburg, though highly critical of Kautsky's position, also denounced the Soviet government for turning the dictatorship of the proletariat into a dictatorship of the party. See her The Russian Revolution. This work was written in 1918, but not published until 1922. End footnote. This evoked an immediate reply from Lenin, the famous The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. And I just so happened to have already pulled this piece up because I knew it was going to be mentioned. The Wikipedia says, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, most frequently published as The Dictatorship of the Proletariat and the Renegade Kautsky, is a work by Vladimir Lenin written in October and November 1918, defending the Bolsheviks against criticisms being made against the Bolsheviks by Karl Kautsky, who was then the intellectual leader of the Second International. Spurred by Kautsky's 1918 pamphlet, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, Lenin's pamphlet, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, was part of an ongoing polemic between various Bolshevik leaders and the Social Democrat Kautsky about the role of democracy and force in the transition to socialism. In The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, Lenin writes that Kautsky, in his 1918 pamphlet, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, distorted Karl Marx's and Friedrich Engels' ideas on democracy and its relation to socialism and revolution. Lenin also writes that Kautsky uses, quote, twaddle, ... to befog and confuse the issue, end quote. For example, when talking about democracy under capitalism, instead of using the term, quote, bourgeois democracy, a term which has clear class content, Kautsky instead uses the term, quote, pre-socialist democracy. An important issue taken up by Kautsky in his pamphlet was the dispersal of the Russian Constituent Assembly by the Bolsheviks. Lenin writes that it is the, quote, crux, end quote, of the pamphlet, and that it is an important question because, quote, the relation between bourgeois democracy and proletarian democracy here confronted the revolution in a practical form, end quote. Lenin goes on to assert that Kautsky in his pamphlet resorts to lying and falsification of facts in order to try to argue his point. Lenin continues that important fundamental issues, especially for someone claiming to be a Marxist, received no attention from Kautsky, and that Kautsky, quote, evaded them. One issue is whether the, quote, bourgeois democratic parliamentary republic is inferior to the Republic of the Paris Commune or the Soviet type, end quote. Essentially, whether or not socialism is a higher form of democracy than bourgeois democracy. Back to the text. In 1919, Kautsky returned to the attack in no less stringent terms with his Terrorism and Communism. Footnote. English translation by W.H. Carriage, London, 1920. First German edition, Terrorismus und Kommunismus, Berlin, 1919. According to Wikipedia, Kautsky responded to Lenin, for the Wikipedia for Kautsky's Terrorism and Communism of 1919. Kautsky responded to Lenin's counterattack with a second pamphlet on the deteriorating political situation in Soviet Russia, a tract entitled Terrorismus und Kommunismus, ein Beitrag zur Naturgeschichte der Revolution. Terrorism and Communism, a Contribution to the Natural History of the Revolution, completed in June 1919. With both Russia and Germany descending into chaos and civil war, Kautsky lamented, quote, a world sinking under economic ruin and fratricidal murder, end quote, with socialists fighting against socialists in both countries, quote, with similar cruelty to that practiced more than half a century ago by the Versailles butchers of the Commune, end quote. Kautsky sought to draw a historical parallel between the ongoing Russian Revolution and Civil War with the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror which followed, culminating in the overthrow of the revolution by the military dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. After expounding at length upon the dialectic of revolutionary violence in the historic French context, Kautsky turned his focus in the final section of Terrorism and Communism to, quote, the communists at work. Kautsky contended that World War I had brutalized the working class and forced the working class, quote, both morally and intellectually. Forced the working class backwards, quote, both morally and intellectually, end quote. The social catastrophe of the war had brought about the Russian Revolution, Kautsky noted, leading to a collapse of the army and confiscation by the peasantry of landed estates for division into individual plots of land. The Bolsheviks made calculated use of this elemental force, in Kautsky's view, quote, introducing anarchy in the country, end quote, in exchange for, quote, a completely free hand in the towns in which they had already likewise won over the working class, end quote. Mass expropriation of businesses followed, Kautsky charged, quote, without any attempt being made to discover whether their organization on socialist lines was possible, end quote. Kautsky. Success depended upon a, quote, well-disciplined and highly intelligent working class, end quote, Kautsky contended, but instead the war had sapped both intelligence and discipline from the workers, leaving only, quote, the most ignorant and most undeveloped sections of the working class in the wildest excitement, end quote. The result had been economic collapse. A new system of brutality had emerged. In Kautsky's view, quote, the bourgeoisie appears in the Soviet Republic as a special human species whose characteristics are ineradicable. Just as a Negro remains a Negro, a Mongolian a Mongolian, whatever his appearance and however he may dress, so a bourgeois remains a bourgeois, even if he becomes a beggar or lives by his work. The bourgeoisie are compelled to work, but the bourgeoisie have not the right to choose the work that they understand and which best corresponds to their abilities. On the contrary, the bourgeoisie are forced to carry out the most filthy and objectionable kind of labor. In return, they receive not increased rations, but the very lowest, which scarce suffice to appease their hunger. Their food rations equal only a quarter of those of the soldiers and of the working men who are employed in the factories run by the Soviet Republic, ... From all this we perceive not a sign of any attempt to place the proletariat on a higher level, to work out a, quote, new and higher form of life, end quote, but merely the thirst for vengeance on the part of the proletariat in its most primitive form, end quote. Kautsky. Kautsky singled out Bolshevik leader Leon Trotsky for specific criticism, upbraiding Trotsky for having seized power despite an admitted foreknowledge that the Russian working class and the revolutionary intelligentsia acting in its name had lacked, quote, the necessary organization, the necessary discipline, and the necessary historical education, end quote, to successfully establish a new economic and political regime. Corruption had flourished in the aftermath, and economic production had fallen to a point approaching complete collapse. Soon realizing the necessity of technical experts, Kautsky quotes Trotsky's admission that violence had been used to mercilessly destroy the organizations of, quote, saboteurs, using coercion to transform, quote, the saboteurs of yesterday into servants, into administrators and technical managers, wherever the new regime demands it, end quote. A new centralized administration had emerged, Kautsky contended, one in which, quote, the absolutism of the old bureaucracy is come again to life in a new, ... but by no means improved form, ... end quote. Kautsky. New forms of profiteering, speculation, and corruption were emerging, Kautsky charged, so that, quote, industrial capitalism from being a private system has now become a state capitalism, end quote. Kautsky. Kautsky concluded that ultimately the use of force and dictatorial methods would lead not to socialism, but to some new oppressive social system. It was to this challenge that Trotsky was to respond. Back to the text. This time it was Trotsky who replied. In 1920, while engulfed in the conduct of the Civil War, Trotsky found time to compose a major work bearing the same title as that of the Kautsky book. Footnote. The first English translation appeared under the title The Defense of Terrorism, published in London 1921. The first American edition bore the title Dictatorship versus Democracy, 1922. A more recent English edition with the original title, Terrorism and Communism, was issued at Ann Arbor, 1961. The final section of this work deals with questions of economics and labor and will be referred to in the next chapter. End footnote. Now I'm going to read the Wikipedia on terrorism and communism. Terrorism and Communism, a reply to Karl Kautsky, is a book by Soviet Communist Party leader Leon Trotsky. First published in German in August 1920, Terrorism and Communism was written against a criticism of the Russian Revolution by prominent Marxist Karl Kautsky, who expressed his views on the errors of the Bolsheviks in two successive articles: Dictatorship of the Proletariat, published in 1918 in Vienna, Austria, followed by Terrorism and Communism, published in 1919. Trotsky's book, the first English edition of which bore the title The Defense of Terrorism, dismisses the notion of parliamentary democracy to govern Soviet Russia and defends the use of force against opponents of the revolution by the dictatorship of the proletariat and working class masses. I'm going to read pretty deep into this Wikipedia, actually. Early in August 1918, mere months after the November 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, which brought the Communist Party to power in Russia, European Marxist Karl Kautsky published an oppositional political tract, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, which charged the Bolsheviks with fomenting civil war due to the Bolsheviks' failure to uphold the norms of universal suffrage. Kautsky's pamphlet, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, asserted that the only way to control the growth of bureaucracy and militarism and to defend the rights of political dissidents was through parliamentary democracy based upon free elections, and that V.I. Lenin and his political associates had blundered badly by departing from democratic practice in favor of a restricted electorate and the use of extra-parliamentary force. The Bolsheviks had sought broad international support from socialists around the world with a view to the achievement of worldwide revolution on a comparatively short timetable, and Kautsky's sharply critical book was regarded by the Bolshevik Party leader Lenin as a rank betrayal of the Russian Revolution and a grave threat to the revolutionary socialist mission. Countering the public opposition of the world-famous Marxist Kautsky was regarded as pivotal. Lenin was quick to respond to Kautsky's book with a bitter counterattack of his own, the short book The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, written in October and November 1918. Lenin railed against Kautsky's pamphlet as, quote, the most lucid example of that utter and ignominious bankruptcy of the Second International about which honest socialists in all countries have been talking for a long time. End quote. Lenin charged that Kautsky had stripped Marxism of Marxism's, quote, revolutionary living spirit, end quote, by Kautsky's rejection of, quote, revolutionary methods of struggle, end quote, thereby turning Karl Marx into a, quote, common liberal, end quote. Quoting Friedrich Engels as an authority, Lenin contended that, quote, proletarian revolution is impossible without the forcible destruction of the state machine and the substitution of the state machine for a new one, end quote. Lenin minced no words in asserting as a, quote, plain truth that, quote, dictatorship is the rule based directly upon force and unrestricted by any laws, which is not how Marx conceived it. There's a very important piece on this channel that's a critique of Slavoj Žižek by Alan Johnson about the kind of like way that like the dictatorship of the proletariat is viewed as like this kind of like ruthless, unrestricted, undemocratic dictatorship. That's that kind of, and criticizes that legacy. There's, Slavoj Žižek's like, oh yeah, we need, this kind of like ruthless revolution that is able to assert the common will without recourse to institutional restraint, or without being restrained by institutional law, right? So the dictatorship, the idea of like people not having like rights or entitlement under the dictatorship of the proletariat is like a ridiculous idea. Quote, this is another quote by Lenin, "The revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is rule won and maintained by the use of violence by the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, rule that is unrestricted by any laws," end quote. Lenin rejected Kautsky's parliamentarian and legalistic interpretation of the ideas of Marx and Engels, contending that Kautsky knew well that the duo had, quote, repeatedly spoke about the dictatorship of the proletariat before and especially after the Paris Commune, end quote, of 1871, and that Kautsky had intentionally made a, quote, monstrous distortion of Marxism, end quote, to bolster his own moderate political ideas. I think what is actually the case, this is just a side note from myself, is that if you listen to Maximilien Rubel or Hal Draper or any of these kinds of figures, I think that they note that the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat was used only, seriously 15 times in the whole of their work. Maybe I'm getting the exact number wrong, but it's not a concept they repeatedly draw upon. And to the extent that they do, it's not in this idea of this ruthless state that has no self-restrictions. Anyway, and then here's the part, and then I'm going to skip the part that's about Karl Kautsky because I just read that. And it says, Trotsky's Terrorism and Communism, 1920. This is still the Wikipedia. Trotsky replied to Kautsky with a short book completed at the end of May 1920 and published in Hamburg in August by the publishing house of the Berlin-based West European Secretariat of the Communist International. Terrorismus und Kommunismus anti-Kautsky. Terrorism and Communism against Kautsky. The book was written, Trotsky remembered, in 1935 inside a coach attached to his armored train during the tumultuous Polish campaign of the Russian Civil War. Trotsky retrospectively ascribed the book's harshness of tone to the time and place in which it was written. Trotsky recalled, quote, "So long as the class struggle flowed between the peaceful shores of parliamentarism, Kautsky, like thousands of others, indulged himself in the luxury of revolutionary criticism and bold perspectives. In practice, these did not bind Kautsky to anything, but when the war and the afterwar period brought the problems of revolution onto the field, Kautsky took up his position definitively on the other side of the barricades. Without breaking away from Marxist phraseology, Kautsky made himself, instead of the champion of the proletarian revolution, the advocate of passivity, of a crawling capitulation before imperialism," end quote. Trotsky. In the view of Trotsky partisan Max Shachtman, Trotsky based his defense of the political tactics of the early Soviet Republic around two primary matters: the question of the revolutionary seizure of power and, quote, the methods to be pursued by a socialist revolution in realizing socialism, end quote. Shachtman. In Shachtman's view, Trotsky consistently urged that, quote, special circumstances had made Russia ripe for a socialist revolution, the seizure of power, end quote, while at the same time the backwards agrarian nation was, quote, not at all ripe for the establishment of a socialist society, end quote. For this, assistance from neighboring advanced industrial countries would be needed, and thus, quote, European revolution was therefore regarded by all Bolsheviks as the only salvation of the Russian Revolution, end quote. This necessitated the rapid reorganization of European socialist parties on the Bolshevik model, according to Trotsky, marked by a splitting of the radical revolutionary socialist left wing of each from its parliamentarian and pacifist center and right. With respect to the socialist reorganization of the Russian economy, Trotsky rationalized and generalized from the ongoing experiences of war communism, which featured, quote, labor armies, directed to specific tasks in a quasi-military and more or less dictatorial way, and Trotsky urged similar militarization of the workers based on the Russian experience. Trotsky observed this strategy as obsolete when Lenin pressed through the adoption of the new economic policy 1 year later. So the economic portion of Trotsky's book was later dismissed by Shachtman and other Trotsky followers as an anachronistic transmutation of, quote, the expediencies and necessities of the Civil War period into virtues and principles, end quote. Trotsky defended the use of terror by the Soviet government against the enemies of the Russian Revolution on utilitarian grounds. In the estimation of intellectual historian Baruch Knei-Paz, for Trotsky, quote, the sacredness of human life, end quote, was not rejected in principle, but it was not, a value so absolute as to overshadow all other values, end quote. Akin to the principle of self-defense, Trotsky argued in Terrorism and Communism that, quote, the taking of human life was not only a necessary evil but an expedient act in a time of revolution, end quote, in Knei-Paz's view. Trotsky justified the use of terror against the revolution's enemies by asserting that terror's use was directed and controlled by the working class itself rather than by a small circle of individuals in a political party. The use of parliamentary democracy to maintain the socialist revolution was dismissed out of hand by Trotsky, and the demands for parliamentary democracy's use called mere, quote, fetishism. Parliamentarism was a cloak and a fiction employed to mask the rule of capitalist societies by vested economic interests. In Trotsky's view, whereas the dictatorship of the proletariat was able to make use of organized state power by the working class, to crush the working class's opponents and to pave the way for social transformation, the employment of political force, of violence and terror was both essential and unavoidable during the revolutionary transition period from capitalism to socialism from Trotsky's perspective. Quote, the man who repudiates the dictatorship of the proletariat repudiates the socialist revolution and digs the grave of socialism, end quote, Trotsky wrote. And this is another section of the Wikipedia. Almost done here, kids. Chapter structure. Terrorism and Communism, a reply to Karl Kautsky, is divided into 9 chapters, bracketed by an introduction and an epilogue. The first section of the book, 4 chapters, deals with the practical political issues of holding power in Soviet Russia, with the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat in theory and practice, and with the nature of democracy and the use of force in the Russian context. A transitional middle section compares the Paris Commune with the Russian Revolution, emphasizing the political tactics and fate of each and upbraiding Kautsky for a lack of fidelity to the revolution, in which his failure is contrasted with the published writing of Karl Marx. There follows 2 lengthy chapters on the specific political and economic policies of Soviet Russia during the ongoing period of war communism, followed by a concluding polemic entitled Karl Kautsky, His School and His Book. New section. Publication history. Terrorism and Communism is a widely reprinted book of Leon Trotsky, which has been translated into a host of languages. The Russian original, Terrorism and Communism, saw print in 1920 and was excerpted in issues 10 and 11 of the eponymous magazine of the Communist International. German, French, Latvian, and Spanish editions followed later in 1920. Terrorism and Communism appeared the next year in translations in English, Bulgarian, Italian, Finnish, and Swedish. The year 1922 saw a first American edition of the booklet as well as a Yiddish book in translation into Lithuanian through a magazine. The Ukrainian edition followed in 1923. In subsequent decades, the book has seen print in Arabic, Chinese, Czech, Danish, Greek, Japanese, Serbo-Croatian, and Turkish, with multiple editions in some of the aforementioned languages. Legacy. Trotsky's Terrorism and Communism motivated another pamphlet by Kautsky titled From Democracy to State Slavery, a Debate with Trotsky, completed in 1921. The work was never translated into English. In it, Kautsky noted the existence of drought and famine in Soviet Russia, a deadly situation which Kautsky asserted was exacerbated by a dysfunctional form of agrarian organization, transportation problems resulting from the disruption of the national railway system, which impeded the importation of food from non-famine areas, and bureaucratic paralysis. In this 1921 reprise, Kautsky returned to his theme that Trotsky and the Bolsheviks had been reckless in rushing to socialist revolution in a country ill-suited for the event economically or intellectually, intimating that economic collapse and famine were inevitable byproducts of this lack of preparation. Political scientist Baruch Knei-Paz chronicled the political thought of Leon Trotsky and noted that Trotsky was among the first of the Soviet figures to justify terror, but this was done for the purpose of the revolution. Knei-Paz stated that Trotsky viewed terror as a temporary, albeit necessary, measure against the old Tsarist regime during the Civil War. Conversely, Knei-Paz contrasted this use of terror with the methods adopted by Stalin during the Great Purge, which was taken to an unprecedented scale and became a permanent feature of the Soviet system. So, here we are. So we finished the Wikipedia for terrorism and communism. Now we can read on. Although at the turn of the century Kautsky had entertained, this is back to the text, although at the turn of the century Kautsky had entertained the possibility that Russia may be among the first to achieve a radical government, in Kautsky's work of 1919, Kautsky argued that the attempt to effect a socialist transformation of the country was premature. In Kautsky's view, socialism could not be realized anywhere except on a democratic basis, and where the majority of the population rejected socialism, there was no alternative but to postpone socialism's implementation until that level of political and cultural development had been reached which would create a socialist majority. The Bolsheviks in Russia, faced with a hostile population, had decided, according to Kautsky, to ignore all opposition and to impose socialism from above. The consequence has been the worst of political excesses, the dictatorship of a minority, bureaucratization, force and terror. A backward, unprepared Russia was being forced to keep all at once, to leap all at once into the socialist millennium. But in fact, in Kautsky's view, dictatorship would lead not to socialism, but to a new form of barbarism. In considering Trotsky's reply, we may profitably pass over that part of Trotsky's reply which was an attack on what he saw as Kautsky's devotion to the, quote, fiction of, quote, bourgeois democracy. Trotsky here added nothing new to the well-known Marxist critique of democratic or parliamentary institutions. The unique aspect of Trotsky's book, and that which not unjustly has been responsible for its notoriety, lies in its views on the use of force, compulsion, and terror. Trotsky went far beyond the position merely that in time of revolution and civil war such methods were unavoidable. Trotsky's attitude was far more positive. Trotsky made a virtue of necessity and argued for the use of these methods as measures necessary not only for the protection of the Soviet regime, but for the advance of socialism. Thus Trotsky declared at the outset, quote, "Who aims at the end cannot reject the means," end quote. And it is clear from the rest of the book that Trotsky saw no contradiction between the means used and the goal aimed at. Trotsky's defense of the use of terrorism by the Soviet government was therefore based on an extreme form of utilitarianism. The, quote, sacredness of human life, end quote, was not rejected in principle, but it was not for Trotsky a value so absolute as to overshadow all other values. Just as there may be justifiable grounds for killing in war or as a means of self-defense, so the taking of human life was not only a necessary evil, but an expedient act in time of revolution. Quote, if human life in general is sacred and inviolable, we must deny ourselves not only the use of terror, not only war, but also revolution itself, end quote. Trotsky. However, those who now most vociferously denounce the use of terror by the revolutionary regime were the very persons who, according to Trotsky, in the past had themselves used terror, intimidation, and repression to protect their own interests. The principle of the, quote, sacredness of human life, end quote, was not one which they had themselves adhered to or intended adhering to, and it was a principle which could become truly inviolable only in the context of a new social system to which the revolution itself was devoted. Quote, to make the individual sacred, we must destroy the social order which crucifies the individual, and this problem can only be solved by blood and iron, end quote. Trotsky. What, however, made one terror, the red, better than another, the white? Trotsky quite clearly identified the superiority of one terror over another with the superiority of the cause in the name of which that terror was used. And, in the case of the Russian Revolution, the struggle was between progress and reaction, the new order against the old, the forces of light against the forces of darkness. What justified the Red Terror was the nature of the goal the Red Terror was used to advance, the goal of socialism in general, the classless society in particular. The terror of those who opposed the revolution was aimed at conserving a social regime serving the interests of the few. That of the revolution itself sought a social regime serving the interest of all. For this reason also, the latter was more effective than the former. Quote, terror is helpless, ... if terror is employed by reaction against a historically rising class. But terror can be very efficient against a reactionary class which does not want to leave the scene of activity, end quote. Quote, but where, end quote, Trotsky asked, quote, is the guarantee, ... that it is in fact the Bolshevik Party which expresses the interest of historical development, end quote. And Trotsky replied, quote, we have suppressed the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, and the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries have disappeared. This criterion is sufficient for us, end quote. So Trotsky saw history marching on the side of the righteous, and victory became a criterion for the justness of the cause. It followed, therefore, that, quote, the man who recognizes the revolutionary historic importance of the very fact of the existence of the Soviet system must also sanction the Red Terror, end quote. Trotsky. And as to the, quote, degree of terror employed, it is not a question of, quote, principle, but of, quote, expediency. It would be superfluous to remark that this way of justifying the use of violence and compulsion is reminiscent not only of Rousseau's famous adage about, quote, forcing men to be free, end quote, but also of the legitimacy attributed to the worst excesses of certain 20th century regimes, amongst them the Soviet regime, which would one day turn its terror on Trotsky himself. Footnote. In later years, however, Trotsky would distinguish between this terror and that of Stalin. End footnote. End footnote. But even more glib was the manner in which Trotsky sanctioned the terror by attributing the terror directly to the will of a class. Trotsky took it for granted that the working class itself was exercising control and direction of the use of terror. There is not the slightest suggestion throughout the book that it was the Bolshevik Party, much less a handful of men, which decided how and against whom terror was to be activated. And this is, of course, because Trotsky identified the party directly with the proletariat. Thus it was the working class itself which had, quote, recourse to severe measures of state terror, end quote, which would, quote, suppress, ... all attempts to tear power out of its hands, end quote, and so on. Trotsky's arguments in defense of terrorism were also characteristic of Trotsky's defense of the Soviet dictatorship, the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat. The possibility of sustaining a revolutionary regime through formal democracy was dismissed out of hand by Trotsky. The concept of the parliamentary majority was a, quote, fetishism. It was a form of rule typical of bourgeois society in which, in any case, not the majority ruled, except as a fiction, but the vested economic interests. The dictatorship of the proletariat, conversely, was that form of government which assured true representation of the majority, which made possible the organization of state power against the still unrelenting forces of reaction, and which enabled the working class to lay the foundations for the eventual transformation of society. Quote, "It is clear that if our problem is the abolition of private property and the means of production, the only road to its solution lies through the concentration of state power's entirety in the hands of the proletariat and the setting up of the transitional period of an exceptional regime, a regime in which the ruling class is guided, not by general principles calculated for a prolonged period, but by considerations of revolutionary policy." End quote. Trotsky. Political force in the form of this dictatorship of the proletariat was an essential and unavoidable feature of revolutionary transition. The social basis of society could not be changed by parliamentary legislation, even if it were to receive the backing of the majority, since bourgeois interests would themselves resort to extra-parliamentary means to subvert the effects of such legislation. Compromise on issues affecting the fundamental fabric of society was impossible. On such issues, quote, "only force can be the deciding factor," end quote. Thus, the dictatorship of the proletariat was the framework of revolution itself, the form of government which, facilitating a monopoly of power, created the political conditions for effecting social change. And though this dictatorship's ultimate purpose, the abolition of state power, it was itself the most extreme form of such power, being decreed by the exigencies of revolutionary struggle. Trotsky applied the means-end principle to the dictatorship of the proletariat in the same way Trotsky had done in the case of terrorism. Quote, "The man who repudiates the dictatorship of the proletariat," end quote, Trotsky declared, quote, "repudiates the socialist revolution and digs the grave of socialism," end quote. However, as in the case of terrorism, so here, the question arose as to what was the actual role of the proletariat. In what sense was the dictatorship that of the proletariat? In what sense was it in the name of the proletariat? It was precisely this question which Kautsky had stressed in his attack on the Soviet dictatorship. Trotsky replied as follows, quote, "We have more than once been accused of having substituted for the dictatorship of the Soviets the dictatorship of our party. Yet it can be said with complete justice that the dictatorship of the Soviets became possible only by means of the dictatorship of the party. It is thanks to the clarity of its theoretical vision and its strong revolutionary organization that the party has afforded to the Soviets the possibility of becoming transformed from shapeless parliaments of labor into the apparatus of the supremacy of labor. In this, quote, substitution, end quote, of the power of the party for the power of the working class, there is nothing accidental, and in reality there is no substitution at all. The communists express the fundamental interests of the working class. It is quite natural that, in the period in which history brings up those interests, in all their magnitude, on the order of the day, the communists have become the recognized representatives of the working class as a whole." End quote. Trotsky. It was only natural, therefore, that while the Soviets were the, quote, organ of power, quote, general control, while the Soviets were the, quote, organs of power, quote, general control, end quote, was concentrated in the hands of the party. It was the party which had the, quote, final word in all fundamental questions, end quote, and the party's central committee the ultimate powers of decision. Quote, "This affords extreme economy of time and energy, and in the most difficult and complicated circumstances gives a guarantee for the necessary unity of action," end quote. Trotsky. So much had Trotsky become enamored of the party, in fact, that Trotsky now considered the, quote, progress of the socialist revolution in every other country, end quote, as, quote, depending, end quote, on the creation of, quote, just as authoritative a communist party, end quote, as in Soviet Russia. The future of socialism, in short, had become directly linked with the undisputed authority of the political vanguard. Footnote. 2 chapters of Terrorism and Communism are devoted by Trotsky to an analysis of the Paris Commune of 1871. Trotsky had given over a large part of his Terrorism and Communism to a discussion of the Commune, with a view to showing how the Commune differed from the Soviet dictatorship of the proletariat. In Trotsky's view, the Commune had shown a respect both for human life and the principles of democracy, a respect totally absent in the Soviet case. In replying to this denigrating comparison, Trotsky argued that, in the first place, the Commune was, quote, the living negation of formal democracy, ... The Commune was the dictatorship of working-class Paris over the peasant country, end quote. Trotsky. And, in the second place, to the extent that it placed humanitarian considerations above long-term political considerations, the Commune merely hastened its own demise and the Commune's final disaster. In fact, the differences between the Commune and the Soviet regime, according to Trotsky, grew partly out of the lessons which the Soviet regime had learned from the Commune's failure. The need for a central organization, discipline, strong leadership, ruthlessness towards enemies, and absolute control of the organs of government and force. Trotsky concluded this analysis by interpreting Marx to have taken a similar view of the defects of the Commune. In brief, those very elements which Trotsky had deemed praiseworthy in the Commune were, in Trotsky's view, the source of the Commune's weakness. For other of Trotsky's writings on the Commune, see the following, something in Russian, written in late 1905 as a preface to Karl Marx, the Paris Commune. This preface, parts of which were later incorporated by Trotsky in his Results and Prospects, deals primarily with the post-1905 situation in Russia and only secondarily with the Commune. Where am I? Les Leçons de la Commune, written in February 1921 as a preface to Cital la Commune de 1871. In all these writings, the Commune is described as the original example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. For Trotsky's pre-1917 writings on terrorism, see his Sochenenia 4, where he denounces individual terrorism. Okay, so that's the end of the section. That's the end of the footnote. That's the end of the section. Thank you so much for listening.